this computer. Okay. It's nice to see so many names I recognize, some that I don't. Thank you so much for being here. So this is our first annual CREPCON event with the hope that this will happen every year in the future. It is so exciting to have you all here and to have CREPE be in a place to be able to support these experiences for folks and for students especially. So if you're only mildly familiar with CREPE, a really quick summary is that it is a project run almost entirely by volunteers that supports instructors and students in completing replications of specific studies. So I'll be talking more about the logistics of CREPE this afternoon in the last talk. So if you're interested, please stick around for that. We have a really exciting program. I'm just going to run through it really quick. I'll introduce our first guest speaker in just a few minutes. That's Jon Grahe. At 10:30 US Central Time, we will have our student poster session, and that's 90 minutes long, followed by a short break. After that, Dr. Christina Bacciu will be joining us to talk about how her experiences with CREPE have shaped her career and her work. And then she'll be joined by two other CREPE alum, Dr. Eric Gelfi and Nicole Mathis, to talk about their careers both within and beyond the Academy. And then, as mentioned, I will give a short informal talk on teaching with CREPE. All of you are welcome to join any or all of those. I strongly encourage you during the poster session especially to let your avatar wander around GatherTown and to make sure you ask the students who are there to tell you about their work and their replications, because that's really why we're here. Okay, so let me introduce you to our first speaker and then let him take over. I wrote this introduction myself, so Jon, you can tell me how many stars it gets later. So Dr. Jon Grahe is a professor of psychology, author, hiker of mountains, planter of trees, musician, colleague, friend. You're probably other things too. And to say that this person has had an impact on open science is an understatement. So in addition to co-founding the CREPE and running it for its first few years, Dr. Grahe has been involved in a bevy of other open science initiatives. In my opinion, his truest gift is his mentorship, which I say both as a mentee and as someone who has watched him mentor other people. To Jon, no one is more important than the next. And he is just as willing to provide his mental labor to a student as a Nobel laureate, probably more likely to provide it to a student. So he has an impressive list of accomplishments, which I can't go through because it's already time for him to start talking. But if you look closely, what you will always see are the ways that Dr. Grahe elevates others with his work. So he's here to talk about the history of CREPE. For folks who are used to listening to me talk about CREPE, what you might not know is that by the time I became director, CREPE was a thriving, sustainable entity already, thanks to the work of those who came before me, specifically Jon. It is not easy to start a new organization and have it survive, but Jon did, and we're all better for it. So I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm so excited about this talk. Yay, Jon, yay. Okay.
All right, and that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I'm excited to share this story actually because it's one that really doesn't get told, and it's getting recorded. And so now it will be recorded for perpetuity. So the rise of the CREPE, a persistent journey. I can't run my PowerPoint slideshow and share screens in Zoom, so I apologize. We're going to lose some animation here. But here's the overview of the talk that I'm going to go through. And essentially, I'm going to take us through the point where Jordan took over. And so I'm going to use two metaphors throughout the talk. One is an arduous canoe trip. When Jordan asked for me to share what I'd talk about in my talk, this is what I came up with. This is this little statement here. The creation of successful CREPE reflects a canoe trip from the headwaters of authentic research methods, curricula crashing into the misdirected currents of scientific methodology. And then I'm also going to do the Graves' replications metaphor because it's my favorite. So to start, why did this happen? And so I want to start with asking you, have you ever taken a week-long canoe trip? This is actually a real picture from, I think, about 1986. maybe 1985. I'm actually in that picture, and this is us about to disembark on a week-long trip. And you are your own motor. You have to carry everything on your own. If there's a crisis, it's up to you to address it. You have to find your own lodging. How is that relevant to building the CREP? Well, I was alone and I was my own motor. Undergraduate research faculty do not have graduate students support. So we had to bring our own materials. I like to tell people that I excel in building organizations on zero budget. The CREP had essentially a zero operating budget until Jordan earned the first CREP grant. So there I am, for those of you who figure that out. All right, so what else was going on? Well, I kept struggling as an instructor of research methods between what I was telling students in class, this is what you need to do to conduct good research, and then, oh, by the way, if you want to get it published, you got to do these other things, and they weren't the same. And that conflict really caused me a lot of angst in the classroom. It caused me angst when I was trying to write papers, because the papers weren't conveying what I wanted to convey. And I sat down and thought about the 15 to 30 projects I gathered, helped them mentor each year, and how they all went in the trash can, except for the very few that we could manage to get out. And then I did some research. I found that there were 100,000 majors per year in the United States alone. And I started doing some math and I said, we need to do better. By the way, there's the cover of my book where you can learn more about my long journey in open science and authentic research methods well beyond the CREP. But it is a nice supporting textbook if you're using CREP in the classroom. All right, the headwaters of authentic research. This is a picture of a beaver pond that actually sits on the South Fork of a river that dumps into the Pacific Ocean. So these are actually headwaters. You are standing on Beaver Dam number 2, as we like to call it. In my graduate school, I was given training that led me to understand the value of authentic research and open science. One was use effect sizes, not p-values. I learned what the correct use of a priori tests were. We always looked for large N for effect sizes. And early on, data and methods and material transparency were critical to the lab that I worked in. So there I was getting, this is what you should be doing in the lab. On the other hand, I was engaging early on in researching in the classroom where we were trying to do what we were doing in the class to take it to publication. So I call authentic research work in the class that's intended for sharing beyond. So early in class, like there's a couple there where a student came to me and said, you know, there's this thing, you can read the scrambled message, it doesn't impact reading. I'm like, well, let's test that empirically. That became a paper. I engaged in early crowdsourcing work. The School Spirit Study Group arguably is the first ever large-scale open invitation project in psychology, founded by Alan Reifman for a paper. And then Alan then formed what I then relabeled as the Emerging Adulthood Measure of Multiple Institutions. He didn't call it anything. There wasn't a title when he had it. So I was participating in early crowdsourcing as a participant, and I was doing authentic research in my class. I was ready to engage students in larger projects. On the other hand, what were the misdirected currents? Well, in grad school, I had that too. I learned to collect as many variables as possible just to find one that was significant. I watched people determine when to end running projects based on statistical significance. I was often told to not burden the reader with my errors, particularly in the introduction. And I was taught how to use stepwise regression in exploratory fashions effectively. All of those things now today in modern science are things that we don't think are good science practices. What other things were going on? Well, you know, in the early 2000s, if you were around, you know, we were engaging in a lot of things like stopping rules that weren't appropriate or using a priori as though it were post hoc. And so if you want to learn more about that, Wickert's and Company identified 32 researcher degrees of freedom, meaning 32 places in the research process where our decisions could impact the outcome without us knowing it. For me, the Scientific Utopia papers by Nosek and Company are a really good description of why we came to this point where this thing called the replication crisis and what we should have done about it. The other aspect, and I won't spend a lot of time here, but one of the things for me in this talk is that message out for you. The first answer for any question is almost always no. Whenever I'd say, hey, I got this new idea, the first response from almost everybody is no. So you have to have that capacity. It's almost a salesman mentality that you got to be willing to say it 10 times. You take nine no's before you get a single answer. And then the other thing is that there's absolutely no support in various areas, grant-wise or home institutions, for novel ideas. So I was warned against doing the CREPE. I was warned against these type of projects because it would destroy my career. In a lot of ways, the opposite happened, but that's not the way academic mentality works. All right, so you got to build the canoe. You got to prepare and build the canoe. In 2009, I woke up and I had a grand idea. In June of 2009, I went, oh my God, I can fix psychology. And I called everybody I knew. I said, finally, for the first time, I feel like I actually did something of value. Here's my grand idea. Here's a picture of a canoe that I found and decided to redo and refix. Much like some of my grand ideas, that canoe didn't work. So I completely redid it. I finished the external part, but I used some of the wrong compound, and now the canoe is a flower bed. All right, so here was my grand idea back in 2009. If APA or APS or some large institution identified 10 projects, then students could go focus on those. Remember, 100,000 students were collecting data per year in the United States. Now it's even bigger than that. So what else do we need to do? Well, like I said, like that canoe, some of mine didn't work. My first attempt at a CREPE-like activity was called the CREP. We ended up with 3 ideas submitted. A couple of papers came out, but we never got that large onboarding where everybody got included. Psi Beta actually has been engaged in large-scale research for longer periods of time than any of us, but they focused all on pedagogy so that students were prepped for 4-year college. Jerry Rudman, hands down, huge applause for doing that. We collaborated 1 year. Psi Beta and Psi Chi put together a national research replication of the International Situations Project. Again, we collected about 1,250 subjects, but the data weren't great. The research question didn't really get students excited, and it was not something that was going to be sustainable. So those are my 2 broken prototypes. The next thing that we needed to do was find people to work with. So as I was not functioning well in these broken prototypes, Brian Nosek, who is the Center for Open Science chair and one of the leaders of open science, contacted me and said, John, I want you to meet Hans Eiserman and Mark Brandt. They're in the Netherlands and they want to do undergraduate replication in the United States. I told them if they wanted to do that, they should talk to you. So the 3 of us got together and they said, hey, we have this thing called the CREPE, and let's go. So that was where the first time the CREPE came out. I'm going to go a little bit further before I talk directly about the CREPE. So the CREPE we had to have all our supplies so that we could last until it was sustainable, right? And so what did you build? Now by the way, there's my wife. We're at boat landing number 1. If you took that supply on a week-long trip, you wouldn't get very far. That's us planting trees on the backside of the wetlands. But it is a nice image of how you've got a boat, you've got to fill it up with with your supply. So what did we fill it up with? That's what we filled it up with: research transparency and the open science framework. So here is an early slide that I used to give back in the day when I was doing about 10 talks a year, one time 40 talks a year, trying to get the CREP off the ground. And so this is how we were addressing researcher degrees of freedom, because the CREP was set up to protect itself with research transparency, and it still has that today. Jordan will talk about that later. The CREP was one of the first groups, organizations to be involved in using the open science framework. When we first started using the OSF, you had to learn to do the wiki. You had to understand code. And so it's really come a long way with copy and paste and images and everything else. So the open science framework allowed us to interact with people that we're never going to meet face to face, because it's free, it's online, it's this beautiful electronic file cabinet. Now, if you want to hear me talk about the OSF, I'll do an hour-long talk just about the OSF and why you should use it. That's not the purpose of today's talk. We had to identify studies. So here's a list of the original set of studies back in 2010. I came to this list. Remember, Mark and Hans had already built the CREP framework. And so what they did is they selected the top cited article from 3 years prior in 9 different subdisciplines. And there's the list. It was problematic, actually, because some of them were not doable for undergrads. One required an hour and a half and 150 subjects and 3 Confederates. Another one required deception. And so some of these, another one requires a level of computing skill that we've only had one group that was ever able to figure that out. And so later, when Jordan talks about how the CREP is run, we've adjusted across time. We had to figure out how to make it more interesting for the students to do them and more feasible so that students could get it done in a semester. We had established a set of procedures. These procedures are pretty close to what they still are today. In the first iteration, there was a review at the end. And so they were supposed to get all this stuff done, and then we looked at the end, and that didn't work very well. So we got that pre-review and the post-review, and so those have been modified to be more effective across time, but this is still basically the same way it's done today. We were fortunate early on to get money for incentives. So the Center for Open Science and the Sci-Chi organization collectively each gave us $25,000 in pledges to offer awards. And we put those awards based on how difficult the studies were. In the end, the awards were not as motivating as I thought they were going to be, because when you got a team of 6, 7, 8, 9, and you start dividing $300 up among that, the number's not that big. And the money wouldn't get to the students often until after they graduated, and then they had to figure out how to get the money across people. So I'm very happy to say that we didn't need the awards, but it was an exciting thing to get that support from Sci-Chi and the CREP. So there we were outfitted. You start your canoe trip, you get going. There were wonderful moments along the way. I'll share some of those here. So on the top left corner, that's the first ever completed CREP project. It happened to happen at PLU, and so I got to have a picture close up. There are a couple other certificates that early on that were shared, pictures of people that presented their posters, a class from somebody who had completed it. So it was exciting to watch students engage in research that more often than not would have been in the trash can otherwise. Another wonderful thing that happened was new travelers. So there at the bottom, Brady Wiggins was a champion of the CREP. That man had more early on projects than anybody else. Every semester, he adopted the CREP in his classroom. Him and Nicole Legate put that in the classroom and institutionalized it in a way that allowed us to figure out how to work with them. You know, in some ways, we were figuring out how to make the CREP work based on Brady and Nicole's functionality. and that was exciting. And third person there is Cody Christofferson. He had a lot of early CREPE. All three of them were early members of the CREPE executive board. And then the other thing that was exciting was meeting students that were willing to work with you remotely. So we're going to learn from, it's hard for me, Dr. Christina Bacchiao. Later, she was a senior when I met her, and she invited me to give a talk at Illinois Institute of Technology after having done the CREPE. And then she agreed to work with me. So she was in Illinois and I was in Washington, and without her work with me in the first years of the CREPE, we never would have happened. It never would have functioned. I ended up with my own RAs at PLU over time, but it was Christina that would train my RAs. And so wonderful moments. It was actually during that period of time when I started recognizing my mentorship. Okay, here we've got the problem with the animation. Behind it, you see that I want to talk about the CREPE as grape replication. Crepes as replications metaphor. And then I was going to hit the button and say, well, you know, I've also thought about rocks as replication metaphor, or flowers as replication metaphor. You just take anything with all of the same genetic material in terms of grapes or flowers, or all of the same molecular material in terms of rocks, and you say, okay, each set would be a replication, but they're not all identical. And it helps us understand why we don't have all the same sets of findings, all the same outcomes, by recognizing that replications are often not equivocal across other systems. And back in the day, I'd say that's why it's CREPE and not CRAP. I could have also done the whole metaphor about the rise of the CREPE and flowers and dough and so on, but you heard the introduction. I like to be outdoors. All right, so this is another stream that is a fish ladder in Olympic National Park. Salmon are jumping up that stream. You can't see them right there, but I did watch some happen. Things that we had to face in the early CREPE. Now remember, the early CREPE was me, Hans, and Mark. And the next thing was getting people involved. And there was a lot of faculty that said, sure, I'll do it. And then they didn't do it. And then there's a lot of people that said, no, I'm never thinking about that. In fact, to this day, very few people at PLU, other than me, adopted the CREPE. So faculty inertia and the way they teach their class has been a real impediment to moving forward. Early on, we didn't know what we were doing with the protocols. We had to figure out the review process. We had to figure out how to interact with the contributors. We had those problematic studies, and we had too much work. Early on, Hans had to move on because it was just too much in his system, and he had to focus on his other aspects of his career. We had to add on other people. We built an executive committee. We built a reviewer board. This is from slides I gave in 2017. You could see that all of a sudden we had this upward trend. That upward trend carried on and carried on. In fact, the year after I left, that number tripled in the first year. Other storms, by the way, this is a picture from Mount Rainier on the Carbon River. I had to cross that bridge. That's a scary moment where you have to get across something that may or may not get taken out by that log. That's what it's like getting 12 people to write a paper together. You know where the end is, you know what has to be done, but the rapids in between there can be very scary. Another thing that challenged us is that, I still haven't face to face met everybody that was on the executive committee when I was the executive director. So how do you interact with people that are in different states, different countries? We were international by the time I left. You're still international now. Well, Google Hangouts, now everything's Zoom. Google Hangouts was a brand new thing, and we really figured out how to work it. And we used asynchronous online meetings. So we'd set up a work line agenda for a meeting, and then we'd give people 3 days to come in and talk about it. On the right, that picture there, by the way, is a whale skeleton that my wife and I discovered on the coast where the Ho River dumps into the Pacific Ocean. That is a whale skeleton. I've never seen a whale skeleton in the wild before. And then finally, overcoming storms and rapids, you need a succession plan. Any good organization needs to outlast the personality. At the time, everything was on my shoulders. If I walked away, and it may have collapsed. And so I knew that I couldn't keep it up. And so I needed a succession plan. There it is. Dr. Jordan Waggy was my succession plan. Over the course of a year and a half, I started training her. At some point in there, I let her know that I had intentions for her to replace me. And then, she then took the CREP where it was, and then it was this functional, sustainable bit. And then it just exploded into this wonderful organization that it is now. So in this last couple minutes, 2 minutes, by the way, I found that Center for Open Science bag on the beach there. I just had to take a picture of it. That's the Pacific Ocean, where the Hoh River dumps in to the Pacific Ocean. What's next for the CREP? So let's say I brought the CREP from the headwaters to the ocean. Well, international collaborations, they're beautiful, they're wonderful, but there's also some threats to the CREP that I worry about. One is COVID and the impact that it had on the way we do research at undergrad level. The other is undergraduate research budgets have all been cut, and educational expectations to me have all been changed. And then finally, by the way, that's a little that's a giant octopus that we found on the beach here in Tacoma. In order for it to continue its sustainability, organizations, the schools still need to value these authentic research experiences, which means that classwork is intended for publication. This benefits students, science, and faculty. I've got lots of talks and papers where I talk about that. The committed network of CREPers. I'm glad to see this organization has brought together people today to build this community. And finally, more successful grants are needed. Go Jordan for getting the first major grant from the NSF. And so, all journeys continue. This is sunset at Gulf Shores, and that's the last moment of light. It's a lot like the last moment of your interactions with an organization. Like the organization, if it's sustainable, will continue beyond the individuals that are running it today. And so the CREP needs to continue looking to how to build for tomorrow. So thank you. I've ran out of time for questions, but I'm happy to talk to anybody at any time about the CREP or the journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was such a wonderful talk, and not just because you said nice things about me. By the way, the grant that we have now, John's hands are all over that. So that was really something we worked on together. And don't give me too much credit. I'll take the credit I earned, but it's so wonderful to hear that history and to know that this is being recorded and we'll be able to save this for folks. So we are going to transition over to the student poster session. And Holly, I believe, is going to post a link and some instructions in the chat here. I will leave the Zoom meeting up for the rest of the day, but I'm going to stop recording this session until we come back in the afternoon. I encourage you to jump over to the Gather Town and to walk around with your little avatar and see the different student posters and chat with them about their work. Thank you so much.